Hey guys, tonight we're going to quietly drift back into history, into the gaslit streets and narrow alleyways of Victorian England, where the fog rolled thick over cobblestones and the night carried secrets that polite society pretended not to see. We're going to talk about something that existed in every corner of every city, something that employed more women than most respectable trades, and yet was spoken of only in whispers, if at all. So settle in, let the world outside fade away, and let's walk together into the dim, complicated reality of those who worked in the shadows of Victorian respectability. The fog settled over London like a wet blanket, thick and yellow, smelling faintly of coal smoke and the River Thames, which was less a river and more an open sewer pretending to be a waterway. It was 1,857, and if you were a young woman standing on the corner of Haymarket, watching the carriages roll past, filled with men in top hats and women in crinolines so wide they could barely fit through doorways, you might have been weighing your options. Not good options, mind you, just options. Because in Victorian England, if you were poor and female, your choices were limited in ways that are hard to fully grasp from the comfortable distance of modern times. You could work 16 hours a day in a factory for wages that wouldn't cover rent and food. You could try domestic service, where you'd work just as many hours, sleep in an attic or basement, and hope your employer wasn't the type to consider you part of the household amenities. You could attempt needlework, going blind by candlelight for pennies, or you could walk the streets, work in a brothel, and make in one night what any of those other jobs would pay in a month. The Victorians loved to talk about morality, about virtue in fallen women and the sanctity of the home, but they were remarkably quiet about the economic realities that made those choices feel less like moral failures and more like survival mathematics. Let's start with understanding who these women actually were, because the Victorian imagination loved to create narratives that had very little to do with reality. The popular story went something like this. Innocent young girl arrives from the countryside, is seduced by a wicked man, loses her moral standing, and inevitably descends into hardship, illness, and an early demise, probably while regretting everything and wishing she'd stayed home to milk cows. It made for compelling moral tales. It also wasn't particularly accurate. Most women who ended up in sex work in Victorian England didn't follow some dramatic narrative of seduction and fall. They drifted into it because they needed money, and this was a way to get it. Many came from working class families already living in cities. They'd worked other jobs first, usually several other jobs, and found them unsustainable. A study from the 1850s found that the largest group of women in London brothels had previously worked in domestic service, followed by needlework and factory work. These weren't naive country girls. These were women who'd already tried the respectable options and found them wanting, which makes sense when you consider that a housemaid might earn 10 to 14 pounds a year, while a woman working even in a lower end brothel could make that in a few months. The term prostitution covered an enormous range of circumstances, from street workers who'd sleep anywhere they could find shelter to women in high end establishments who lived in relative comfort and catered to wealthy clients. At the very top were the grandes horizontals, the famous courtesans who lived in luxury, were kept by aristocrats, and occasionally influenced political affairs from their perfumed bedrooms. These were not the majority. Below them were women working in reasonably well-run brothels, or accommodation houses, as they were sometimes called, trying to sound respectable. Then there were the lodging house workers, the street walkers, the women who worked part-time while maintaining other employment, and at the very bottom, women who were essentially homeless and traded sex for a place to sleep or food to eat. Victorian society liked to treat all of this as one moral category. but the lived experiences were vastly different depending on where you fell in this hierarchy. Let's talk about a brothel in Soho in the 1860s, a middle range establishment, not the worst, certainly not the best. It would have been a townhouse, probably Georgian, that had seen better days. The paint would be peeling slightly, but the windows would have curtains, red or purple usually, thick enough to keep prying eyes out and the lamplight in. Inside, the front parlor would attempt gentility with worn furniture, a piano that may or may not have been in tune, and wallpaper that was fashionable about 20 years prior. The woman who ran it, the madam, was usually a former worker herself, someone who'd managed to save enough money to rent a house and establish her own business. She'd be somewhere in her 30s or 40s, shrewd, practical, and completely unsentimental about the nature of what she was running. This wasn't a charity. This was a business, and she ran it with the attention to profit margins that any Victorian shopkeeper would recognize. The women who worked there, usually between 5 and 10 of them, would have arrangements that varied. Some lived in the house, sleeping in small rooms on the upper floors, their rent deducted from their earnings, along with fees for food, clothing, and any other expenses the madam decided to charge. Others lived elsewhere and came to work in the evenings, which gave them more independence but less security. The financial arrangement was simple in theory and exploitative in practice. A client would pay the madam, who would take her cut, usually 50% or more, and the worker would receive what remained. Except the worker also owed money for her room, her meals, the laudanum the madam provided when someone needed to numb themselves enough to get through the night, the gin that flowed freely to keep clients happy and spending, the dresses she was expected to wear because clients had expectations about appearances. The system was designed to keep women in debt, dependent on the house, unable to save enough to leave. The madam would say this was fair, that she was providing room and board and protection and clients. The workers, if they were honest after enough gin, would say it felt like being trapped in a very specific kind of economic cage. A typical evening would begin around dusk. The women would prepare themselves, which meant washing with cold water from a basin, applying powder and rouge that they'd have to pay for, putting on dresses that showed enough to attract interest, but not so much that they'd be arrested if they stepped outside. Because, yes, the workers could be arrested for soliciting, but the clients who solicited them somehow never were. The logic of Victorian morality was fascinating in its contradictions. The parlor would be lit, the piano would be played if anyone could play it, and the women would wait. Some nights, clients would arrive steadily. Other nights, they'd sit for hours in their uncomfortable dresses, listening to the clock tick, knowing that whether clients came or not, they'd still owe the madam for their room and board. When clients did arrive, they'd come through the door quickly, glancing around to make sure they weren't seen, because respectability was everything in Victorian England, and being seen entering a brothel could damage a man's reputation, though apparently not enough to stop them from entering. The establishment served a wide range of male clients from various levels of Victorian society. Young men from respectable families were sometimes brought by relatives or acquaintances to gain experience in a controlled environment. Middle-aged businessmen and office workers, often married, sought companionship outside the home where marital relations were viewed primarily as a means of procreation rather than pleasure. Sailors on leave, soldiers, university students, and even some members of the upper classes who chose mid-tier establishments for their accessibility and variety also visited. Victorian social norms emphasized modesty, innocence, and restraint for middle and upper class women, creating a cultural divide that led many men to seek paid companionship elsewhere. This arrangement reflected broader societal attitudes that treated female virtue as a marker of social status, while viewing sexual services as a commercial transaction provided by working class women. Encounters upstairs were typically brief and businesslike, though some could be more difficult or unpleasant. The women developed various coping methods to manage the emotional and physical demands of the work. Some used alcohol to dull their senses, while others relied on laudanum, a widely available opium based tincture used at the time for pain relief and other ailments to help distance themselves mentally. Many learned to mentally detach during encounters while remaining physically present. They shared information among themselves about challenging clients, including those who were aggressive, refused payment, or made unreasonable demands. The madam was expected to maintain order and intervene if situations became unsafe, though her main priority was the financial success of the business. Infectious diseases, particularly syphilis and gonorrhea, were widespread in such environments, with no reliable cures available. Treatments like mercury based remedies often caused serious side effects. Women attempted to check clients for visible signs of infection, but many cases went unnoticed or were ignored. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s required women in certain towns to undergo regular medical examinations and, if found to have certain conditions, to be detained for treatment, measures that applied only to the women involved, not their clients. The risk of pregnancy was another ongoing concern. Available contraceptive methods were limited in reliability and accessibility. Some women used chemical douches or inserted devices, though success varied. When prevention was unsuccessful, the available options carried significant health risks as medical and legal restrictions limited safe choices. Victorian society provided little support for women facing these circumstances, and outcomes were often difficult for both the women and any children involved. The women who worked in these houses came from specific circumstances, but they weren't all the same, and the Victorian tendency to lump them together as fallen women missed enormous variations in experience and motivation. Some were there temporarily, working to save money for something specific, planning to leave when they'd accumulated enough, though the debt structure made that harder than it seemed. Some had children to support, either living with relatives or in workhouses, and sent money when they could. Some had been orphaned young and had no family at all, no safety net, no one to fall back on if they failed. Some were remarkably pragmatic about it, viewing it as work that paid better than alternatives, and trying not to attach moral weight to what was essentially an economic transaction. Others struggled constantly with shame, with the gap between who they'd been taught they should be and whose circumstances had required them to become. Religion complicated everything, as it tended to do in Victorian England. The society was steeped in Christian morality, in ideas about sin and redemption, and fallen women who could only be saved through repentance. Charities existed to rescue prostitutes, to bring them back to virtue through religion and work, usually needlework again, because apparently going blind making shirts for pennies was more virtuous than earning actual money. These rescue homes were sometimes helpful and often patronizing, run by middle and upper class women who meant well but couldn't quite grasp that virtue was easier to maintain when you weren't hungry. The women who ran these charities would talk about saving souls while offering wages that ensured the women they saved would likely return to sex work within months. The rescue narratives loved stories of repentant Magdalenes, weeping over their sins and embracing new lives of respectable poverty. But the reality was that most women who left prostitution did so because they'd saved enough money to start some other business or married someone or aged out of the work, not because they'd been rescued by evangelical reform efforts. Let's talk about Mary, not her real name because we don't know her real name, but a composite of women whose lives appeared in records from the 1860s, in court documents, and hospital records and reformer accounts. Mary was 23, had been working in a Soho brothel for 4 years, and had come there after 2 years in domestic service that ended when the master of the house decided she was part of the amenities, and she decided that if this was going to happen anyway, she might as well be paid properly for it. She lived in a small room on the third floor, barely larger than the bed that filled most of it, with a window that looked out onto a back alley where rats fought over garbage and drunks slept in doorways. She paid the madam 8 shillings a week for this room, plus costs for food and drink and clothing, which meant she usually cleared about 10 to 15 shillings a week after expenses if she was working steadily. This was still more than she'd made in service, still more than her sister made in a factory, but it came with costs that weren't measured in money. She'd learned to assess clients quickly, to read danger in the way a man moved or spoke, to know when to smile and when to call for the madam. She'd had ribs broken once by a client who decided that paying meant he could do whatever he wanted, and the madam had called a doctor who'd charged 5 shillings to tape her ribs and told her to rest for a week, which she couldn't afford to do because rest meant no income and no income meant more debt. She'd been pregnant twice, both times using an abortifacient that a midwife sold for 2 shillings, a nasty tea that made her violently ill but ended the pregnancies. She'd watched other women in the house sicken with syphilis, their bodies failing in stages, and wondered when it would be her turn because it seemed inevitable, just a matter of time. She used laudanum most nights, just enough to smooth the edges to make the work bearable, and told herself she wasn't dependent, even though she woke each morning thinking about when she could take the next dose. Mary had plans, vague ones, the kind of plans that kept you going. She was saving money, hiding coins in a tin box under a loose floorboard, though the madam had a way of discovering these caches and adding unexpected charges that drained them. She thought maybe she'd save enough to rent a room somewhere else, to work independently without the madam's cut, though independent workers were harassed constantly by police and had no protection from violent clients. Or maybe she'd save enough to leave London entirely, go somewhere smaller, start over, though start over is what she wasn't sure. The weight of being a former brothel worker would follow her, visible somehow, even if she never spoke of it, because Victorian society had a way of marking women, of knowing or deciding it knew who'd fallen and who'd remained pure. She tried not to think too far ahead. The present was enough to manage. The future was fog, thick and impenetrable, and trying to see through it was just another way to feel hopeless. The house itself had rhythms, patterns that structured time. Sundays were usually slower because respectable men were supposed to be with their families, attending church, maintaining appearances, though some came anyway, guiltily, quickly, as though speed would somehow reduce the sin. Weekends were busiest, when men had leisure and money and fewer obligations. The nights stretched long, from dusk until whenever the last client left, which might be midnight or might be dawn. During the day, the women slept or tried to, though the house was never truly quiet, always footsteps and voices and the sounds of a city that never completely rested. Some women used the daylight hours to walk, to get out of the house, though they had to be careful about where they went and how they dressed because police could arrest them for soliciting even if they were just walking to buy bread. Victorian laws around prostitution were magnificently contradictory, making the work itself legal but criminalizing almost everything associated with it, ensuring that women could be arrested and fined and jailed, while clients and brothel owners faced far fewer consequences. The legal situation was its own special kind of chaos, because the Victorians excelled at creating laws that reflected their moral anxieties rather than practical realities. Brothel keeping was illegal, technically, but enforcement was selective and usually targeted the most visible or disorderly houses, while countless others operated openly because local police and officials were either bribed or simply looked the other way. Soliciting in public was illegal for the women, but not for the clients who solicited them. Living off the earnings of prostitution was illegal, which theoretically meant madams and pimps could be prosecuted, but in practice, this was rarely enforced. The Contagious Diseases Acts added another layer, creating a system where women in designated areas could be detained on suspicion, forced to undergo invasive examinations, and confined if found diseased, all without trial or real recourse. The acts were eventually repealed after decades of campaigning by women's rights activists who pointed out that maybe, just maybe, a system that only punished and controlled women while ignoring male clients was not actually about public health, but about controlling female sexuality and mobility. Let's talk about what happened when women tried to leave, because the Victorian narrative loved redemption, but the actual process was significantly more complicated. A woman who'd worked in a brothel for several years and wanted to transition to respectable employment faced obstacles at every turn. She'd need references, which she wouldn't have. She'd need to explain where she'd been and what she'd been doing, and the truth would disqualify her immediately from most positions. She'd need to hide her past, create a plausible alternative narrative, and hope no one asked too many questions or recognized her from the streets. If she tried to marry, she'd face similar problems, because Victorian men, even working class men, wanted wives whose virtue was unquestionable, whose pasts were blank slates they could approve of. The double standard was so ingrained that no one even questioned it. Men could visit brothels throughout their lives, before and during marriage, and remain respectable. Women who worked in those same brothels were permanently marked, permanently fallen, permanently outside the boundaries of acceptable society. Some women managed to navigate the challenges through determination, careful planning, or sometimes sheer luck. They managed to save money despite the systems that made saving difficult. Some relocated quietly, moving to new areas or cities, creating plausible new backgrounds. They would start small businesses, work in various trades, or find legal and independent work. Some married individuals who either didn't know or didn't mind their histories, though the fear of the past being revealed was a constant worry that could disrupt everything they had built. Others remained in difficult circumstances until old age, illness, or exhaustion forced them out, often ending up in institutions or living alone, which was the unfortunate outcome that society had indirectly structured through various societal expectations. Children born to women in difficult circumstances faced their own set of challenges. Some were sent to orphanages, while others were raised in the same environments as their mothers, often in challenging situations that society tended to view with disdain. As these children grew older, especially daughters, their options often remained limited. Many found themselves drawn to the same work their mothers had done, familiar with it from their upbringing and with few other alternatives. This cycle continued for generations as poverty and limited opportunities for women created a path that led them to similar outcomes, regardless of societal reform attempts or moral standards. The economic realities were clear when one looked beyond societal judgments. The systems in place made it incredibly difficult for working class women to survive on legal wages alone, and poor families struggled to provide for all their children. Any disruption, whether illness, job loss, or the death of a family member, could push people into desperate situations. Meanwhile, society held expectations for upper class women to maintain purity and ignorance, leaving many men to seek experiences outside of their marriages. These forces combined to create a high demand for certain forms of work, where for many women it was one of the few viable options. However, these systemic issues were rarely addressed. Instead, society focused on individual moral failings, avoiding the need to question larger social structures. The connection between societal expectations and marriage was more complex than many were willing to acknowledge. Marriage in the upper and middle classes often functioned as an economic transaction where women were seen as property passed from father to husband. This arrangement required women to produce heirs and maintain homes, while love, though desired, was not essential. Sex, too, was viewed primarily for procreation, and wives were often expected to endure rather than enjoy it. This led to many marriages being less intimate than expected, with men seeking sexual fulfillment outside their marriages. These men often had both a wife and access to other women, maintaining the illusion that respectable women and those in difficult circumstances were entirely separate, when in fact both were influenced by the same social and economic pressures. Let's drift back to that brothel in Soho, to the women waiting in the parlor on a Wednesday evening in November when the fog was particularly thick and the cold seeped through the walls and the fire in the grate wasn't quite enough to warm the room. They'd been sitting for over an hour with no clients, and the madam was getting irritable, which meant she'd start making comments about rent and usefulness, and perhaps it was time for certain girls to work harder or find somewhere else to live. The women sat quietly, used to this, not bothering to respond because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse. One of them played the piano badly, a tune that might have been a popular song or might have been something she was inventing, the notes wandering aimlessly through the room like the smoke from the cigarettes. Another was mending a dress, her needle moving steadily through the fabric, her face carefully blank in that way that suggested she was thinking about something far away from this room and this moment. A third was drinking gin steadily, methodically, determined to be at least partially drunk before any clients arrived, because that was her strategy and it had worked well enough so far. When clients finally did arrive, three of them together, young men from their clothes and their loud confidence, they brought cold air and noise and the kind of aggressive good humor that meant they'd been drinking already and were looking for entertainment, which could mean easy clients or difficult ones, depending on how drunk they were and what they considered entertaining. The madam greeted them warmly, all business now, offering drinks, encouraging them to sit, to relax, to take their time choosing. The women arranged themselves attractively, smiling in practiced ways, and the negotiations began. That careful dance of suggesting without being too obvious, of attracting interest without seeming too eager, because clients wanted to feel like they were choosing, like they had power in the transaction, even though everyone in the room knew exactly what was being purchased and for how much. One of the young men chose Mary, and they went upstairs to her small room with its narrow bed and basin and window overlooking the alley. He was drunk enough to be clumsy, but not so drunk he couldn't function, which was probably the best you could hope for in these situations. He talked while he undressed, boasting about something, his family's business or his prospects or some accomplishment she didn't listen to closely enough to remember. She made encouraging sounds, smiled at appropriate moments, and went through the mechanical motions of what he'd paid for, her mind mostly elsewhere, running through her mental calculations of what she'd earned this week, what she still owed, how much more she needed before the madam would be satisfied. When he finished, he became awkward, suddenly aware that he was naked in a small room with a woman he just paid, and the post-transaction moment was always strange, neither of them quite sure how to end the interaction. He dressed quickly, left money on the small table, and departed without looking directly at her, which was common enough. Most men couldn't quite meet the eyes of women they just paid for sex, as though eye contact would make the transaction too real, too human, too much like acknowledging that the woman was a person and not just a service purchased. Mary washed herself from the basin, cold water that made her gasp, and dressed again in the evening clothes that the madam required for parlor time. She took a small dose of laudanum from the bottle she kept hidden in her room, feeling the familiar, warm relaxation spread through her, smoothing the edges of the evening, making the prospect of going back downstairs and waiting for the next client feel manageable instead of unbearable. This was her routine, repeated night after night, and she'd become so accustomed to it that she rarely thought anymore about how strange it was, how far from the life she'd imagined as a girl growing up in a two-room apartment with her parents and siblings, crowded and poor but together. That past felt like it had happened to someone else, some version of herself that had ceased to exist when she'd left domestic service and arrived at this house 4 years ago. She'd learned not to dwell on it. Nostalgia was another luxury she couldn't afford. Back in the parlor, the other two young men had made their choices and the house settled into its working rhythm, clients coming and going, money changing hands, the madam keeping careful track of everything in a ledger she maintained with the attention of a banker, because this was business and every transaction mattered. The night would continue until the early morning hours, until the last client stumbled out into the foggy darkness and the women could finally stop performing, stop smiling, stop pretending interest or pleasure or anything other than exhaustion. Then they'd climb the stairs to their small rooms, collapse into their narrow beds, and sleep the heavy sleep of people who'd learned to rest whenever possible because tomorrow would require doing it all again. Disease and deterioration were constant background realities. The slow erosion that everyone in the house understood but rarely discussed. One of the older women, she was probably 30 but looked 40, had developed symptoms that everyone recognized. The sores and skin lesions that meant syphilis had progressed beyond the early stages. She was still working because she needed money, and the madam hadn't thrown her out yet, but her days in the house were numbered. Soon she'd be too obviously ill to attract clients, and then she'd be gone, probably to a charity hospital or a workhouse or to die in some rented room, and another woman would take her place in the rotation. The turnover was constant, women arriving and leaving, disappearing into whatever futures awaited them, while the house itself continued unchanged, a permanent institution outlasting its temporary inhabitants. The relationship between the women in these houses was complex, built on shared circumstances, but not necessarily on friendship. They were competitors for clients, for the madam's favor, for the best rooms in the least dangerous situations. They were also the only people who understood what this life was actually like, who could be honest about the realities without judgment or moral panic. Some formed close bonds, protective relationships where they looked out for each other, warned each other about bad clients, covered for each other when someone was sick or too drunk to work. Others maintained careful distance, treating each other as colleagues in a business arrangement and nothing more, afraid that too much emotional investment would make the inevitable departures and disasters harder to bear. The madam discouraged deep friendships, preferring that the women remain somewhat isolated from each other, easier to control, less likely to organize or demand better conditions. She'd learned from experience that women who formed strong alliances were women who might decide collectively that they deserved more than she was willing to give. The police were another constant presence, though their relationship with brothels was more complicated than Victorian laws suggested it should be. Officers on local beats knew exactly which houses were operating, could walk past the red curtain windows every night and understand perfectly well what was happening inside, and mostly they looked the other way because they'd been doing so for years, and there was a comfortable understanding that as long as things stayed relatively quiet and money changed hands in appropriate directions, everyone could continue as they were. Some officers took bribes directly from madams, a few shillings a week to ensure that raids happened elsewhere, that arrests targeted street workers instead of established houses. Others had arrangements that were less direct but equally effective, relationships with local officials who'd been persuaded that attempting to eliminate prostitution would be futile and expensive, while regulating it through selective enforcement was practical and economical, though no one would say that out loud because it contradicted everything Victorian society claimed to believe about vice and morality. When raids did happen, they were theatrical performances designed to appease reformers and demonstrate that authorities were doing something about the prostitution problem, even though everyone involved knew the raids would accomplish nothing permanent. Police would arrive with warrants, would round up the women, take them to stations where they'd be charged with soliciting or keeping a disorderly house, fined amounts they couldn't afford, and released to go directly back to the same work because what else were they supposed to do? The clients who might have been present during raids were usually allowed to leave quietly through back doors because prosecuting respectable men for patronizing prostitutes would have been scandalous and complicated, while prosecuting poor women was simple and satisfied the public demand that someone be punished for moral decay. The madam usually paid the fines for her workers, then added those costs to their running debts, ensuring that a police raid meant not just the disruption and humiliation of arrest, but also deeper financial entanglement with the house. Let's talk about what the Victorians actually knew about prostitution, because they studied it obsessively while claiming to be horrified by it, producing volumes of research and commentary that revealed as much about Victorian anxieties as about the realities of sex work. Reformers conducted surveys, counting prostitutes in various cities, producing numbers that varied wildly depending on who was counting and what they were counting as prostitution. Estimates for London alone ranged from 8,000 to 80,000, the enormous variation, reflecting both the difficulty of counting something that operated partially underground and the tendency to include any woman whose behavior seemed questionable, which in Victorian terms could mean almost anything. Middle class observers would walk through working class neighborhoods, noting women standing in doorways or walking streets, and conclude they were prostitutes based on nothing more than their presence in public at night, because respectable women were supposed to be safely indoors after dark, protected within homes, not moving through city streets with the independence that suggested they had neither fathers nor husbands to control their movements. Medical men studied prostitution as a public health concern, particularly after venereal diseases became increasingly widespread among military populations. They produced reports documenting infection rates, examining women under the Contagious Diseases Acts, developing theories about prostitution as a necessary evil that regulated male sexuality and prevented worse crimes. This argument appeared constantly in Victorian discourse. The idea that prostitution, while regrettable, served an important social function by providing outlets for male sexual desires that might otherwise be directed toward respectable women. The logic was fascinating in its assumptions. It took as given that men had powerful, essentially uncontrollable sexual urges. It assumed that women, or at least respectable women, did not. It concluded, therefore, that society needed a class of women whose purpose was to absorb and contain male sexuality, protecting the virtue of women who mattered by sacrificing women who didn't. No one seemed to notice or care that this entire framework treated working class women as less than human, as useful objects rather than people with their own desires and rights. But Victorian class structures made that kind of thinking completely natural to people who'd never questioned their own positions in social hierarchies. Religious organizations approached prostitution as a spiritual problem requiring salvation and reform. Rescue homes proliferated, funded by evangelical Christians who genuinely believed they were saving souls, offering women a path back to virtue through prayer, hard work, and acceptance of their degraded status. These institutions operated with strict rules designed to break women of their sinful habits and instill proper subservience and morality. Women were required to attend religious services multiple times daily, to work long hours at needlework or laundry, to confess their sins publicly, to demonstrate appropriate remorse and gratitude for being rescued. They were given new names sometimes, clean slates meant to symbolize their spiritual rebirth, though practically speaking, a new name didn't erase the economic circumstances that had led to prostitution in the first place. The rescue homes offered food and shelter, which was something, but the work was tedious and poorly paid, and the entire environment was designed to be unpleasant enough to serve as penance while still being preferable to the streets, though that calculation didn't always work out the way reformers intended. Many women left rescue homes within weeks or months, finding the restrictions unbearable and the wages insufficient, returning to prostitution because at least there they had some autonomy and could earn enough to survive. Reformers interpreted these departures as moral failure, as evidence that some women were simply too fallen to be saved, too attached to lives of sin to embrace virtue even when it was offered. They didn't seem to grasp that virtue was expensive, that maintaining the appearance and behavior of a respectable Victorian woman required money for appropriate clothing, for housing in decent neighborhoods, for the leisure time to attend church and social functions, and that women working 16-hour days making shirts for pennies couldn't afford any of that. Virtue, like so many things in Victorian England, was ultimately about class, about having enough resources to maintain appearances. And women without resources were always going to struggle to perform respectability convincingly enough to escape the categories society had assigned them. Back in the Soho brothel, winter was settling in properly now, the kind of cold that made the poorly heated house feel even more miserable, frost forming on the insides of windows and everyone's breath visible in the air when they woke. The women wore multiple layers, trying to stay warm while still looking attractive enough for clients, which was a difficult balance. Some mornings the water in the washing basins had frozen, and they'd have to break the ice before they could clean themselves, which was miserable but necessary because the madam had strict rules about hygiene, not out of concern for the women's well-being, but because clients complained if women weren't clean and complaints were bad for business. Disease prevention was impossible in these conditions, with multiple clients daily and no effective barrier methods and no real understanding of how infections spread. So everyone just accepted that illness was inevitable and tried not to think too much about timelines or what the later stages would look like. Mary had been coughing for weeks now, a persistent rattle in her chest that wouldn't clear, and she knew she should rest. But rest meant no income, and no income meant the madam would be irritated and might decide Mary had become more trouble than she was worth. So she drank honey and whiskey concoctions that one of the other women swore helped, took extra laudanum to suppress the cough during work hours, and kept going because there wasn't really an alternative. Illness was another thing you worked through until you physically couldn't anymore, and then you hoped someone would take you to a charity hospital instead of just throwing you out to die in the street, though that hope wasn't guaranteed to be fulfilled depending on how annoyed the madam was and how much you still owed. The other women noticed Mary's cough but didn't comment much, because everyone had something wrong with them, some chronic pain or recurring illness or slow deterioration, and dwelling on it wouldn't help. One woman had broken teeth that she couldn't afford to have pulled properly, so they just ached constantly. Another had scars on her arms from a client who decided burning her with his cigar was entertainment, and the madam had banned that client after that incident, not because she cared about the worker, but because visible scars made the woman less marketable. A third had chronic stomach problems from the cheap gin she drank constantly, which she needed to drink constantly to tolerate the work, which made her stomach worse, which made her drink more, and everyone could see how that cycle would end, but no one mentioned it because what would be the point? The clients who came through the door brought the whole range of Victorian masculinity with them, all its contradictions and anxieties and violence. They were nervous young men, barely more than boys, terrified and excited and often too drunk to function properly, apologizing unnecessarily or being aggressive to cover their embarrassment. There were middle-aged regulars who'd been visiting this particular house for years, who had favored women and routines, and wanted everything exactly as they expected it. There were drunk men who'd become angry when their bodies wouldn't cooperate, who'd blame the women for their own failures, sometimes violently. There were men who wanted to talk more than anything else, lonely, married men whose wives didn't listen or didn't care, who'd pay for an hour and spend 50 minutes talking about their problems before hastily completing the transaction they'd officially come for. There were cruel men who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain, who'd do things they'd never do to women of their own class because they'd learned that money could purchase not just access, but impunity. The women developed reputations among clients based on what they'd tolerate, what they specialized in, what they looked like. Some were known for pretending enthusiasm convincingly. Others were valued for their youth, the madam always ensuring she had at least one or two very young women because certain clients would pay extra for that. Some specialized in acts that others refused, charging premium rates for what the Victorians would have called perversions, but what were really just variations in human sexuality that the official culture pretended didn't exist. The pricing structure reflected these specializations, these hierarchies of desirability and willingness, and women negotiated their own boundaries constantly, trying to balance earning potential against what they could psychologically tolerate, recalculating those boundaries. As circumstances changed and debts accumulated and desperation increased, children were sometimes present in brothels, though reformers loved to act shocked by this, as though there was some other place poor women's children could go while their mothers worked. Some madams allowed women to keep young children in the house, babies and toddlers who'd be kept upstairs during working hours, hopefully sleeping, occasionally crying loud enough that clients could hear them, and would be reminded uncomfortably that the women they were paying were mothers, actual human beings with families and complicated lives, which tended to ruin the fantasy and was therefore discouraged. As children got older, they'd usually be sent elsewhere, to relatives if any existed, to orphanages if not, because having children old enough to understand what was happening was complicated in ways that created problems for everyone. The exception was girls approaching adolescence who might be kept around and gradually introduced to the work, which was its own horror that Victorian society preferred not to examine too closely despite their obsession with childhood innocence and corruption. The concept of the virgin was particularly valuable in prostitution, with some brothels specializing in providing what they claimed were virginal girls to clients willing to pay premium prices. Whether the girls were actually virgins was less important than whether they could convincingly play the part, which meant looking young and acting frightened and reluctant because apparently that was what these particular clients wanted. The trade in virginity was lucrative enough that some girls were sold multiple times, with madams using various methods to fake physical evidence of virginity, creating profitable fictions for clients who either didn't know or didn't care that they were being deceived. The Victorian obsession with female purity created this market, this demand for innocence that could be purchased and destroyed, and then society expressed shock and horror that such things happened while creating exactly the conditions that made them profitable. Age was both an asset and a constant anxiety for women in the trade. Youth was valuable, could command higher prices, attracted more clients, but youth didn't last, especially not under the conditions these women lived in, the poor nutrition and chronic illness and stress and laudanum use that aged bodies rapidly. A woman who looked fresh and attractive at 18 might look worn and used by 25, might find clients requesting someone else, someone younger, someone whose exhaustion wasn't quite so visible yet. The madam would reduce her prices, would place her in less desirable situations, would eventually suggest that perhaps it was time to move on to a different house that catered to less discriminating clientele, which meant moving down the hierarchy into progressively worse conditions until you hit the bottom level of street prostitution, or you found some other way out, or you died. This progression was well understood by everyone in the trade, this inevitable deterioration, and it created constant pressure to save money while you could, to plan for a future where you'd be less marketable, though actually achieving those savings given the debt structures and daily expenses was nearly impossible. Men were aging too, but aging in men didn't limit their access to certain services in the way it did for women. Elderly men continued to visit certain establishments, paying for attention despite their physical decline, because they could. The idea of elderly women engaging in similar behavior, particularly purchasing attention from younger men, was unimaginable in Victorian society, not because it didn't happen, but because older female sexuality was not acknowledged. Recognizing such desires would have challenged many assumptions about gender, power, and desire. The system was built around the belief that male desire was natural and needed an outlet, while female sexuality was either absent for respectable women or only recognized in the context of prostitution, with no consideration for women's personal desires or the complexity of human sexuality. The relationships between madams and their workers were primarily transactional, but sometimes held more complexity, such as mentorship or protection, though still within an exploitative framework. A madam often understood the struggles her workers faced and might intervene on their behalf, offering support in emergencies or protecting them from abusive clients. However, she was also managing a business, keeping workers in debt, and would not hesitate to abandon them if they became unprofitable. Some madams were cruel, seeing workers as expendable, while others maintained a cold, practical approach, doing what was necessary to survive in a harsh system that benefited men at the top. Male brothel keepers, such as pimps, operated through intimidation and violence rather than debt. These environments were often worse than working for a madam, as violence was more direct and protection less reliable. These men maintained control through fear, using violence to enforce discipline, which meant women were often beaten for various reasons, whether real or imagined. Some women preferred this directness as the threat of harm was always present and clear. Others avoided these situations, understanding that violence from clients was already dangerous enough without the added threat from those meant to protect them. The debate over whether women in prostitution chose this work or were forced into it was a point of contention, often discussed without considering the women's perspectives. Reformers claimed that prostitution was always coerced, arguing that economic pressure and male violence made true choice impossible. Some women in the trade agreed, seeing their limited options as a form of coercion, while others defended their autonomy, arguing that while it wasn't an ideal choice, it was a choice nonetheless. This work often paid better than factory jobs and offered more independence than domestic service. The reality was likely somewhere in between, with women's agency constrained by their circumstances, making it a complex decision rather than a simple one of either choice or coercion. Victorian literature loved fallen woman narratives. Endless novels about prostitutes who died tragically after brief lives of sin, usually while repenting and warning other young women not to follow their paths. These narratives served specific cultural functions, allowing readers to vicariously experience transgression while being reassured that sin led inevitably to punishment and death, maintaining moral order even while depicting moral disorder. The actual women whose lives supposedly inspired these fictions would have recognized very little of their realities in the literary versions. The novels were always about beautiful, tragic women who'd been innocent and had fallen through one terrible mistake. They were never about ordinary women who'd made practical economic calculations. They focused on dramatic downfalls and deathbed repentances, not on the daily tedium of managing difficult clients and trying to save enough money to eventually leave. Literature wanted prostitution to be a morality tale. Reality was more interested in whether you could afford to eat tomorrow and whether the cough you developed would get worse or better. The newspapers reported on prostitution constantly, with a fascination that contradicted their claimed moral horror. Stories about brothel raids would include detailed descriptions of the interiors, the clothing the women wore, the arrangements of rooms, everything readers supposedly needed to be properly scandalized, but which read more like guides to where these establishments could be found. Articles about rescue efforts would interview reformed prostitutes who'd provide lurid details about their former lives, carefully edited to be shocking but not too shocking, titillating but morally instructive. The press coverage created a public discourse where everyone could discuss prostitution endlessly while maintaining that they were concerned about moral decay rather than simply interested in the sexual details of other people's lives. Editors understood perfectly well that prostitution sold newspapers, that readers consumed these stories eagerly, and that moral outrage was an excellent cover for what was essentially commercial pornography disguised as social commentary. The actual experience of the work, the physical reality of it, was something the newspapers never quite captured because they couldn't or wouldn't be explicit enough. There was pain, frequent and varied. There was the physical toll of multiple clients in a night, bodies not designed for that kind of repetitive use, the soreness and tearing and infections that came with it. There was the disgust that even women who'd been doing this for years never quite stopped feeling, the revulsion at smells and tastes, and the sheer intimate grossness of strangers' bodies that you had to pretend not to notice, had to act as though you found appealing. There was the psychological dissociation required to survive it intact, the mental distance you had to maintain between your physical self that was performing these acts and your actual self that you protected somewhere deep inside where clients couldn't reach. Some women managed this dissociation naturally, found they could absent themselves mentally while their bodies did what was required. Others never quite mastered it, remained too present, felt everything too acutely, and those women tended to drink more, use more laudanum, deteriorate faster. The clients had fantasies about what this work was like for the women, fantasies that the women learned to perform because that's what they were being paid for. Men wanted to believe the women enjoyed it, or at least that particular women enjoyed it with them specifically, even while knowing on some level that this was a commercial transaction. So women learned to moan convincingly, to say the things men wanted to hear, to act as though this specific client was special, was different from all the others, was genuinely desired rather than merely tolerated for money. It was emotional labor on top of physical labor, this constant performance of desire and pleasure, and it was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with the physical acts themselves. Some clients didn't want or need the performance, were straightforward about the transaction, did what they came to do and left, and those were often easier despite seeming more coldly commercial because at least there was honesty in it, no requirement to fake feelings that didn't exist. Violence was common enough that women developed elaborate systems for assessing and managing risk. They'd learned to read body language, to notice when a man's jaw tightened in a particular way or when his hands formed fists, signs that meant get out of the situation or call for help or prepare to defend yourself. They'd learn which kinds of clients were more likely to be dangerous, very drunk men, men who seemed to hate women generally, men who wanted to talk about their wives in bitter tones, men who were too interested in pain. They'd share information, warning each other about specific individuals who should be avoided or handled carefully. The madam was supposed to protect them, would sometimes intervene if someone screamed loud enough, but madams had their own risk calculations and wouldn't necessarily ban a client who spent money freely just because he was rough with the workers. Violence that left visible marks was discouraged because it affected business, but violence that didn't show was just part of the job, something women were expected to tolerate as part of earning their keep. Pregnancy remained a constant terror despite all the prevention methods, all the douching and pessaries and attempts at withdrawal that clients often refused to cooperate with. When prevention failed, decisions had to be made quickly because the longer you waited, the more dangerous abortion became. The women knew who to go to, which midwives or which back alley practitioners had the necessary skills, or at least hadn't killed anyone recently. The procedures were done in secret, in dirty rooms, without anesthesia beyond perhaps some gin, and the pain was extraordinary, worse than anything most women had experienced. Then you hoped you didn't develop fever, didn't start bleeding too heavily, didn't die from infection, because if you did, there was very little anyone could or would do to help. Women died regularly from botched abortions, their bodies disposed of quietly, the causes of death recorded vaguely, if recorded at all, and everyone who knew what had really happened understood that this was just another risk of the work, another calculation in the daily mathematics of survival. The few women who carried pregnancies to term while working faced impossible situations. No brothel wanted a heavily pregnant worker. It was bad for business. Reminded clients too explicitly that these were real women with real biological functions rather than fantasy objects. Most madams would dismiss women before they showed too much, and then what? Charity hospitals would take women in labor but would treat them with contempt, would let them suffer longer than necessary as punishment for their moral failings, would ensure they understood that whatever pain they experienced was deserved. The babies would be taken, usually, unless the woman could prove she had some way to support a child, which sex workers obviously couldn't, since admitting what they did would mean losing the child anyway. So babies went to orphanages or baby farms, those grim institutions where infants were warehoused and frequently died from neglect or deliberate harm, and mothers would return to work within weeks because they needed money and their bodies didn't matter enough to anyone, themselves included, to justify rest or recovery time. Let's talk about the rare women who succeeded in leaving, who actually managed to save enough money and create new lives for themselves because they did exist, even though the system was designed to prevent exactly this outcome. These women were usually the ones who'd been exceptionally careful, who'd worked in higher end establishments where the pay was better and the conditions slightly less exploitative, who'd avoided laudanum addiction and serious illness and pregnancy, who'd had luck in addition to planning. They'd leave quietly, moving to different cities where they weren't known, creating entirely fabricated histories that positioned them as widows or as women who'd been working in respectable trades. They'd open boarding houses sometimes, or small shops, businesses that could be run by women alone without too many questions. They'd live carefully, always aware that their pasts could be discovered, that former clients might recognize them, that one wrong word could unravel everything they'd built. Some married their way out, finding men who either genuinely didn't know their histories or who knew and married them anyway. These marriages were risky because Victorian law gave husbands enormous power over wives, and a husband who decided to use his wife's past against her could make her life miserable with complete legal backing. A woman with a past in prostitution could be threatened constantly, could be told that if she didn't obey, if she didn't submit to whatever her husband wanted, he'd expose her and she'd lose everything, whatever social position she'd achieved, any children that had any property or money that was legally his anyway under coverture laws. Some of these marriages worked out, were built on genuine affection or at least mutual respect and became reasonably happy. Others were just different kinds of prisons, trading the madam's control for husband's control, different forms of the same fundamental lack of autonomy that defined women's lives across classes in Victorian England. The women who aged out of sex work without managing to leave beforehand faced the bleakest futures. Too old to attract clients, too worn down by years of hard use to do other physically demanding work, often ill with chronic conditions that 19th century medicine couldn't treat effectively. They'd end up in workhouses if they were lucky, on the streets. If they weren't, the workhouse was its own special hell, designed deliberately to be unpleasant enough that only the truly desperate would enter, filled with forced labor and minimal food, and a constant message that poverty was moral failure deserving of punishment. Women who had spent years in prostitution would find themselves breaking rocks or picking oakum alongside women who'd spent their lives in respectable poverty, all of them ground down by a system that had used them up and now wanted them to have the decency to disappear quietly. Death came in various forms, some fast and some slow. Disease was the most common, either venereal diseases in their later stages or respiratory illnesses, like tuberculosis that spread easily in overcrowded, poorly ventilated houses. Women died from botched abortions, from violence at the hands of clients, from alcohol poisoning or laudanum overdoses that might have been accidental or might not have been. They died from simple exhaustion, bodies giving out after years of poor nutrition and overwork and chronic stress. The mortality rate for prostitutes was significantly higher than for other working class women, though no one kept precise statistics because no one particularly cared to document exactly how many women were dying or why. When women died in brothels, their bodies were usually removed quickly and quietly, taken to charity hospitals or morgues, buried in paupers' graves with minimal ceremony. The houses would clean the rooms and rent them to new workers, and business would continue unchanged because death was just another operational detail, unpleasant but manageable, certainly not important enough to disrupt the fundamental economics of the trade. The reformers who worked so tirelessly to rescue prostitutes rarely seemed to understand that rescue required not just moral instruction, but actual structural change. You couldn't save women from prostitution by offering them religious conversion and needlework wages unless you also addressed the fundamental economic realities that made prostitution financially rational despite all its horrors. A woman earning 30 shillings a week in a brothel, even after the madam's cut, wasn't going to be enthusiastic about positions offering 6 shillings a week, no matter how many times you explained that poverty was more virtuous than prostitution. The arithmetic was simple and compelling. The reformers could have advocated for living wages, for women's work, for legal protections for working women, for education and job training that would create actual alternatives. Instead, they mostly focused on individual moral reform, on changing the women rather than changing the system, and then expressed frustration that their efforts had such limited success. The connection between prostitution and Victorian theatrical culture was closer than respectable society wanted to acknowledge. Actresses occupied a strange position not quite respectable, but not quite fallen, engaged in public performance that was artistic but also involved displaying themselves for male audiences, which created uncomfortable parallels with prostitution that everyone noticed but few discussed openly. Many actresses supplemented their theatrical income with wealthy protectors. Arrangements that looked very much like prostitution but were given different names kept women mistresses, courtesans, because the women involved were more beautiful or talented or socially skilled than common prostitutes. The distinction was largely about class and aesthetics rather than any fundamental difference in the transaction. Both involved women exchanging sexual access for financial support, but actresses did it with style and in better accommodations, and somehow that made it more acceptable or at least more interesting to Victorian society. The music halls were another space where these boundaries blurred, where working class women performed for mixed audiences, where the line between entertainer and prostitute was thin and frequently crossed. Music hall performers would meet with admirers after shows, would accept drinks and gifts and sometimes money, would engage in relationships that might be called courtship if the women were respectable but looked very much like prostitution when they weren't. The entire environment of Victorian entertainment was saturated with commercial sexuality, with the understanding that women's bodies were for sale in various forms, and the main question was just how explicitly the transaction would be conducted and how much money would change hands. Let's return to Mary in the Soho brothel, because her cough had gotten worse, bad enough that clients were starting to complain about it, bad enough that the madam had pulled her aside and suggested perhaps she needed to rest for a few days, which was almost kind, except that rest meant no income and the debts would continue accumulating. Mary knew what the cough probably meant, had seen enough women deteriorate with consumption to recognize the pattern, and she was terrified in a quiet, constant way that she tried not to think about because thinking about it wouldn't help. She took more laudanum, told herself she just needed to get through winter, that she'd feel better when spring came and the cold damp lifted. Lies she half believed, because the alternative was acknowledging that her body was failing, and she had no safety net and no savings despite 4 years of work and nowhere to go if the madam decided she'd become more liability than asset. She thought about leaving sometimes, making plans that never quite solidified into action. She could go to one of the rescue homes, she supposed, could submit to their rules and their sermons and their inadequate wages, could try to become the kind of reformed penitent they wanted her to be. But the thought of it exhausted her, all that performed remorse, all that pretending to be grateful for opportunities that would leave her just as poor and with even less independence. She thought about finding another house, somewhere that might be better, though she'd been in the trade long enough to know that better houses were hard to get into and usually weren't much better anyway, just had nicer furniture and wealthier clients who could afford to be demanding in more elaborate ways. She thought about going back to domestic service, but she knew no respectable household would hire her now, that her years in the brothel were probably visible somehow, even if she didn't mention them, that she'd changed in ways that made returning to subservient drudgery impossible, even if it were available. So she kept working, kept taking clients, kept ascending those narrow stairs to her small room with men who became increasingly interchangeable, faces and bodies blurring together into a single composite client who wanted the same things in the same ways and left the same coins on the table before departing. She developed a kind of numbness, an emotional distance that made everything bearable by making nothing quite real. The laudanum helped with that, blurring edges and softening impacts until the whole experience felt dreamlike, something happening to someone else while she observed from a comfortable distance. She knew the laudanum was becoming a problem, knew she was using more than she used to, knew that this was another thing women warned each other about, but she also knew she needed it to continue functioning, and continuing to function was the only priority that mattered, because stopping meant confronting everything she was trying not to feel. The other women in the house were managing their own versions of the same struggle, each with their own methods and breaking points and quiet desperation. One had started visiting a gin palace before work every evening, getting drunk enough to make the night tolerable, showing up to the house already impaired and getting progressively worse as the night continued. And everyone knew that would end badly, but no one said anything because it wasn't their business, and what would they say anyway? Another had developed a relationship with a regular client, had started believing or pretending to believe that he cared about her specifically, that he might take her away from this life, set her up somewhere. And the other women watched this with a mixture of pity and cynicism because they'd all seen versions of this before and knew how it ended, knew that men who promised rescue rarely followed through, and women who believed those promises ended up more disappointed than women who maintained clear-eyed understanding of what these relationships actually were. A new girl had arrived, couldn't have been more than 16, brought by someone who claimed to be her aunt but probably wasn't. The girl's eyes wide and frightened in ways that would disappear within weeks because you couldn't maintain that level of fear constantly. You either adjusted or you broke, and most women adjusted because breaking wasn't sustainable. The madam was pleased with the new arrival, was already advertising her to particular clients who'd pay premium rates for youth, and the other women treated her with a careful distance that might have been protectiveness or might have been unwillingness to get attached to someone who probably wouldn't last long. The new girl reminded Mary of herself 4 years ago, though she'd probably never been that young, that unprepared, and she wanted to warn her about something, but couldn't articulate what exactly she'd warn her about because all the specifics would sound manageable, and it was really the accumulation, the slow grinding down of your capacity to imagine anything better that destroyed you. The seasons changed with mechanical regularity, winter into spring, into summer, into autumn, years blurring together because the work itself remained constant regardless of weather. Summer brought its own miseries, heat that made the small rooms suffocating, sweat and smells that were harder to mask, clients who were irritable and demanding because everyone was uncomfortable, and people took the discomfort out on whoever was available, which in this case meant the women who couldn't refuse them. Winter at least had the cold to dull sensation, to make you grateful for the warmth of even an uncomfortable bed, to justify the layers of clothing that created some barrier between you and what was happening. Spring and autumn were probably best moderate temperatures that didn't add additional physical stress to work that was already physically demanding, but even then, the fundamental nature of it remained unchanged. The same acts, with the same kinds of men, for the same inadequate compensation. The neighborhood around the brothel had its own ecology, networks of establishments that everyone involved knew about, even if outsiders didn't. There were the other brothels, competitors and colleagues, ranging from higher-end houses that catered to wealthy clients to desperate street-level operations where women worked for whatever they could get. There were the pubs that served as informal meeting places, where workers and clients and madams all mingled with surprising openness, because these spaces existed outside normal social rules. There were the pawn shops where women sold whatever they managed to acquire, jewelry from gifts or theft, clothing they'd been given, anything that could be converted to money. There were the back alley abortionists and the herbalists who sold remedies for various complaints, and the moneylenders who charged extortionate rates, and everyone else who made their living from the ecosystem that had grown up around commercial sex. The police were aware of the ongoing activities, conducting regular patrols, accepting payments from brothel owners, and receiving additional forms of compensation from street workers who couldn't afford bribes. They upheld the corrupt system that remained stable, albeit predictable in its corruption. Some offices were purely transactional, viewing their role as an opportunity to extract profits from vulnerable individuals who could not challenge them. Others operated by unconventional codes, protecting women from particularly dangerous clients while still accepting bribes, or alerting brothel owners about imminent raids while arresting street workers who couldn't afford protection. The system was fundamentally flawed, yet it persisted because too many had vested interests in maintaining it, and those in power were uninterested in addressing the underlying structural issues, which would involve examining property ownership, women's legal rights, economic inequality, and other uncomfortable aspects that could disrupt Victorian society's stability. The Victorian fascination with documenting and categorizing extended to the world of prostitution. Researchers sought to develop typologies to classify different kinds of sex workers and investigate the reasons behind their involvement in the profession. They would interview women in institutions or prisons, compile their stories into data, and publish reports that aimed to provide a scientific explanation for prostitution. These studies often revealed more about the anxieties of the Victorian era than the lives of the women themselves. There was a fixation on determining whether women had been seduced or whether they had made the choice freely, as though this distinction mattered more than the economic factors that limited everyone's choices. The prevailing belief was that most sex workers were victims forced into the situation because acknowledging that women might rationally choose sex work over other occupations would imply that respectable jobs didn't offer adequate compensation, raising uncomfortable questions about the broader economic system. The relationship between prostitution and the Victorian marriage market was more similar than society cared to admit, both systems revolving around the exchange of women's bodies and reproductive potential for financial security, but through different mechanisms and with varying levels of societal approval. A middle class woman entering marriage gave up her legal identity, property rights, and bodily autonomy in exchange for social respectability and financial support from a husband who could be either kind or cruel, but who had complete legal control over her. A working class woman entering prostitution traded social respectability and bodily autonomy for a higher income than other available jobs, with control being exercised by madams and clients rather than husbands, but with similarly limited agency. Both systems trapped women, restricted their choices, and treated them as property, either under male control or under the control of other women operating within patriarchal structures. Both systems endured because of a combination of economic necessity and societal beliefs that insisted this arrangement was natural, proper, and in accordance with how things had always been. The ideology surrounding female sexuality, which allowed prostitution to thrive, was complex and deeply contradictory. Respectable women were expected to be devoid of sexual desires, to submit to their husband's needs without seeking pleasure, because any sign of pleasure would suggest a dangerous sexuality that could undermine social order. This belief served to keep middle and upper class women sexually naive, making them less likely to make informed decisions about their own bodies. At the same time, it created a market for prostitution, as men sought to fulfill their sexual desires outside the confines of marriage. Meanwhile, prostitutes were regarded as excessively sexual, women whose overwhelming sexual desire had led them into vice, even though most were simply performing desire, working rather than indulging personal appetites. The entire ideological structure was incoherent, but it functioned because it provided a framework for respectable society to discuss sexuality while maintaining the illusion of sexual purity within marriage and the commercial nature of sex outside it. The contradictions were never closely examined, as doing so would reveal how much of Victorian social order relied on exploitation. Let's talk about the Contagious Diseases Acts in more detail, because they revealed everything about Victorian attitudes toward prostitution, toward women's bodies, toward who deserved rights and who didn't. Passed in the 1860s and expanded over the next few years, these acts gave police in designated military and naval towns the power to arrest any woman suspected of being a prostitute, to force her to undergo genital examination, and if found to be infected with venereal disease, to confine her in a lock hospital for up to 9 months. The justification was protecting soldiers and sailors from disease, maintaining military readiness, public health concerns that sounded reasonable until you noticed that only women were subject to examination and detention. Only women were treated as vectors of disease requiring state control, while the men who contracted and spread the same diseases faced no legal consequences whatsoever. A woman could be walking down the street, could be stopped by police based on nothing more than an officer's suspicion, could be subjected to invasive examination without trial or legal representation, could be confined for months, and all of this was completely legal, supported by medical authorities and military officials and members of parliament who saw nothing problematic about a system that gave the state control over poor women's bodies while leaving men entirely free. The examinations themselves were instruments of humiliation and control designed to be degrading enough to function as punishment, conducted by doctors who treated the women with open contempt, using metal speculums without anesthesia, causing pain deliberately because these women deserved pain, deserved to be reminded of their degraded status. Women subjected to these examinations described them as worse than prostitution itself, as violations that stayed with them, as moments when the state made explicitly clear that their bodies were not their own, that they had no rights anyone was bound to respect. And if examination revealed disease, if a woman was found infected, she'd be sent to a lock hospital where treatment consisted primarily of mercury, which was toxic and only marginally effective, administered in facilities that were essentially prisons with guards and locked doors and rules designed to break women's spirits while supposedly healing their bodies. Women died in these hospitals from mercury poisoning or from diseases that 19th century medicine couldn't actually treat, and those deaths were recorded as unfortunate but necessary, the cost of protecting public health, though public health apparently only meant male health because women's health was never the focus of these interventions. The campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts, led by Josephine Butler and other women's rights activists, was one of the more remarkable reform efforts of the Victorian period because it actually succeeded eventually, though it took decades. Butler and her allies argued that the acts were not about public health but about state control over women's sexuality, that they punished women for male behavior, that they violated basic principles of justice and bodily autonomy. They faced enormous opposition from medical authorities who insisted that regulation of prostitution was scientifically necessary, from military officials who wanted the convenience of having disease-free prostitutes available for soldiers, from politicians who found the whole topic distasteful and wished these middle-class women would stop talking about such indelicate subjects in public forums. Butler's campaign involved speaking openly about prostitution and venereal disease at public meetings, which was shocking behavior for a respectable Victorian woman, arguing with male experts who dismissed her views because she was female and therefore couldn't possibly understand medical or legal matters, maintaining the fight through years of minimal progress and enormous social condemnation. What made the campaign eventually successful was that it exposed the fundamental hypocrisy of the Victorian double standard, forced public conversation about the fact that venereal disease required both male and female participants, but only women were being punished for it. The activists pointed out that if the goal was really public health, then men should be examined and treated as well. But of course, that was unthinkable because respectable men couldn't be subjected to such indignities, couldn't be treated like prostitutes, even though they were the ones creating demand for prostitution and spreading disease just as effectively as women. The acts were finally repealed in 1886, though similar regulatory impulses continued in other forms because the desire to control women's sexuality, to police their bodies, to ensure that women who stepped outside respectable boundaries could be managed and punished, that never went away, just took different shapes in different eras. Back in the Soho brothel, the women would have known about the Contagious Diseases Acts if they were in designated towns, would have lived with the constant fear of arbitrary arrest and examination, though even in areas not covered by the acts, the threat of police harassment was constant enough to create similar anxiety. They developed strategies for dealing with police, knowing which officers could be bribed, which were genuinely dangerous, which could be charmed or manipulated or avoided. They'd learned to recognize plainclothes officers, to spot the signs of an impending raid, to hide or dispose of anything that might be used as evidence against them or against the house. The relationship with law enforcement was another layer of stress, another element of the job that drained energy and required constant vigilance because you were always technically breaking laws, even though everyone knew that prostitution would continue regardless of what the laws said. Mary had been arrested once 2 years earlier, picked up on the street when she'd been walking to buy food, and an officer had decided she looked like a prostitute, which she was, but she hadn't been working at that moment, and the arbitrariness of it had been infuriating. She'd spent a night in jail, been fined 5 shillings that the madam had paid, and then added to her debt, been released with a warning that appeared nowhere in official records but hung over her like a threat because repeat offenses meant harsher penalties, could mean weeks or months in prison, could mean losing her place in the house. The experience had taught her to be more careful about when and how she appeared in public, to avoid certain streets at certain times, to always be aware of who was watching, which was exhausting but necessary because the law was not protecting her. The law was another force she had to navigate around, another element of a system designed to ensure that women like her remained vulnerable and easily controlled. The economics of brothel keeping were instructive if you examined them closely, revealed exactly how profit was extracted and who benefited at each level. The madam paid rent for the house, paid for basic furnishings and supplies, paid occasional bribes to police, and those were her primary expenses. Her income came from taking 50% or more of what clients paid, plus all the additional fees she charged workers for room and board and clothing and medicine and anything else she could justify. A successful house with 5 women working steadily could generate substantial income for the madam, enough that some brothel keepers became quite wealthy, owned multiple properties, had the respectable investments that no one questioned too carefully because money had a way of washing itself clean if you had enough of it. The workers, meanwhile, remained perpetually in debt despite working constantly because the fee structure ensured they could never quite catch up, could never save enough to leave. It was a system designed to trap labor, to extract maximum value from workers while giving them just enough to survive, and it wasn't fundamentally different from how other Victorian businesses operated, just more explicit about the nature of the exploitation. Property owners who rented to brothel keepers were making substantial profits from prostitution while maintaining complete respectability, and no one questioned this because the fiction was maintained that landlords didn't know what their properties were being used for, even though obviously they knew, everyone knew. But as long as the pretense was maintained, then respectable businessmen could profit from vice without compromising their social standing. The rent charged for brothels was typically higher than for other residential properties because landlords understood they could demand premium rates from madams who had limited options, who couldn't exactly advertise in newspapers for appropriate premises. So, at every level of the system, people were extracting profit from prostitution while maintaining distance from it, claiming not to know or not to be responsible or to be merely providing neutral services like property rental that happened to be used for immoral purposes, but that wasn't really their concern. The supply chains that supported prostitution were extensive, from the gin sellers who sold alcohol to brothels at markup prices, to the doctors who treated venereal diseases and performed abortions for fees they'd never charge respectable patients, to the pawnbrokers who accepted stolen goods without asking too many questions, to the laudanum suppliers who knew perfectly well their product was being used for addiction management but sold it anyway because profit was profit. All of these people were embedded in the sex work economy, dependent on it for their livelihoods, but able to maintain social distance from it because they weren't the ones actually performing sex acts, weren't the ones visible on the streets, weren't the ones society labeled as fallen. Victorian morality had created elaborate hierarchies of culpability where the women who sold sex were considered morally degraded, while everyone who profited from their labor was somehow exempt from moral judgment, and that hierarchy was maintained through careful social performance, through knowing what not to acknowledge, what not to discuss, what to pretend ignorance about. Let's talk about the children who grew up in and around brothels because they existed despite Victorian preference to pretend they didn't. Young children who lived in these houses while their mothers worked would absorb an education very different from what respectable Victorian society imagined childhood should be. They'd learn early that sex was a transaction, that women's bodies were commodities, that men paid for access and women provided it. They'd learn to recognize drunk men and dangerous men and lonely men, would learn to make themselves invisible when clients were present, would understand long before adolescence exactly what their mothers were doing and why. The psychological impact of this was something Victorian reformers worried about obsessively producing literature about corrupted innocence and children doomed by their environments, but they never quite managed to connect this concern to the economic realities that made it impossible for women in prostitution to afford separate housing for their children or alternative care arrangements. Daughters of prostitutes faced particularly constrained futures, were often assumed to be destined for the same work as their mothers, and that assumption became self fulfilling because respectable employment was essentially closed to them. If your mother was known to be a prostitute, no middle class household would hire you for domestic service. No shop would take you as a clerk. No factory would want you because the moral taint was hereditary, was assumed to have corrupted you regardless of your own behavior. So girls would drift into sex work because it was available and they already knew how it functioned and the stigma was already attached to them anyway. And then reformers would point to this pattern as evidence that prostitution corrupted across generations without ever acknowledging that they'd helped create the very pattern they deplored by ensuring these girls had no other option. Sons of prostitutes had slightly more possibilities, could sometimes escape the stigma if they left the neighborhood and concealed their backgrounds, but they also grew up understanding that women were for sale, that their mothers had been for sale, and that created its own psychological complications that Victorian society had no framework for addressing. The medical profession's relationship with prostitution was thoroughly hypocritical, with doctors simultaneously treating prostitutes for disease, examining them under the Contagious Diseases Acts, providing abortions for fees, and writing learned articles about the moral and physical degradation of women who sold sex. Doctors who'd never hesitate to examine and treat a prostitute in a lock hospital would refuse to see the same woman in a private practice because treating her would compromise the respectability of his patient list. Medical men published extensively about prostitution, creating taxonomies and theories about what kind of women became prostitutes, often arguing that there was something physically or mentally defective about these women, some flaw that had predisposed them to vice. These theories conveniently ignored the economic factors and blamed individual pathology, allowed doctors to position themselves as scientific authorities while avoiding any examination of social structures that might implicate their own class in creating the conditions for prostitution. The use of working class women's bodies for medical education was another intersection of prostitution and medicine that revealed class dynamics clearly. Medical students learned gynecology by examining prostitutes and other poor women in charity hospitals, practicing on bodies that couldn't refuse because treatment was conditional on allowing students access. These women would be examined repeatedly by multiple students, their bodies treated as teaching tools rather than as belonging to actual people with rights to privacy and dignity. The same women whose bodies were used to train doctors would then be refused treatment by those doctors once they'd established private practices, because respectable practitioners served respectable patients, and the women who'd been instrumental in their education were no longer useful once their teaching function was complete. The entire system depended on poor women's bodies being available for whatever purposes middle and upper class institutions required, whether that was sexual use by men who paid for it or medical use by doctors who needed to practice their skills. And in both cases, the women's own needs and preferences were irrelevant. Philanthropic efforts directed at prostitutes were numerous and well intentioned and largely ineffective because they addressed symptoms rather than causes, individual women rather than systemic problems. Charity organizations would provide temporary shelter, religious instruction, training in domestic skills, all designed to redeem fallen women and return them to virtue. But virtue required economic support that these organizations couldn't or wouldn't provide. You couldn't maintain a respectable appearance on charity wages, couldn't afford the clothing and housing and leisure time that respectability required, so women would cycle through rescue homes and return to prostitution because the economic calculation remained unchanged. Some charities recognized this and attempted to provide more substantial support, helping women emigrate to colonies where their pasts wouldn't be known, funding small businesses, providing more realistic training and wages. But these efforts were limited in scope and reach, couldn't possibly address the scale of the problem when thousands of women were working in prostitution in London alone. The rescue narrative itself was problematic, positioned prostitutes as passive victims requiring salvation by their social betters rather than as people making active choices within constrained circumstances. The women who ran rescue homes were often sincerely compassionate, genuinely wanted to help, but they came from class positions that made it difficult to understand what they were asking women to give up. A middle class reformer could talk about the dignity of honest labor because she'd never had to do backbreaking work for starvation wages, could emphasize spiritual rewards because she'd never had to choose between food and rent, could insist that virtue was more important than money because she'd never been in a position where that choice was real rather than theoretical. The gulf between reformers and the women they wanted to reform was enormous, bridged occasionally by individual relationships but never fully overcome, and that gulf meant that rescue efforts were often experienced by their targets as patronizing and unrealistic, however kind the intentions behind them. Mary had been approached by rescue workers twice in her years in the brothel, women who'd stopped her on the street and offered her a path back to virtue, who told her about homes where she could live and work and remake herself into someone acceptable. She'd listened politely both times, had even considered it briefly because the idea of leaving was always somewhere in her mind, but the practical details never made sense. The homes paid pennies for endless labor, required constant religious observance that felt performative and exhausting, treated women like children who needed to be supervised and corrected constantly. And even if she'd endured all that, even if she'd spent a year in a rescue home learning to be a better laundress or seamstress, she'd emerged with no savings, no resources, no better positioned economically than she'd been before, except now she'd be a year older with a year's worth of lost income. The mathematics didn't work, and Mary was practical enough to recognize that, so she'd thanked the rescue workers and continued on her way back to the house, where at least she understood the terms of her exploitation clearly. The fantasy of the rescued prostitute, reformed and grateful and living a quiet life of respectable poverty, was enormously appealing to Victorian moral imagination because it suggested that the system could work, that individual redemption was possible, that society's structures didn't need to change fundamentally. Every story of a successfully rescued woman was publicized widely, used to justify continued charitable efforts and to demonstrate that fallen women could rise again if they just tried hard enough, if they truly repented, if they embraced the opportunities given to them. These narratives ignored all the women who couldn't be rescued because they were too ill, too addicted, too deeply in debt, too old, too tired, too realistic about what rescue actually offered. They ignored the structural factors that created prostitution in the first place, the economic inequality and limited opportunities and legal restrictions on women's work, and the entire framework of Victorian gender relations that positioned women as dependent on men and then punished them when their dependence took forms other than marriage. The seasonal patterns of prostitution demand reflected broader Victorian social rhythms, with business increasing during periods when men had money and leisure. When Parliament was in session, London brothels did excellent business serving politicians and officials who were living away from their families. During major sporting events or holidays, when men gathered in groups and alcohol flowed freely, demand increased. The Christmas season was perversely busy, with men celebrating the birth of Christ by visiting brothels, apparently seeing no contradiction between religious observance and purchasing sex. Military paydays meant increased business, with soldiers spending their earnings on alcohol and women in predictable patterns that brothel keepers planned around. These rhythms were completely understood by everyone in the trade, with madams adjusting their operations to accommodate busy periods, bringing in additional women temporarily, raising prices when demand was high. The women experienced these busy periods as exhausting, multiple clients per night, sometimes seeing men back to back with minimal breaks, bodies becoming sore and minds becoming numb from the sheer repetitive nature of it, but also as opportunities to earn more, to potentially save a bit extra, though the madam would find ways to claim most of that extra income through special fees or unexpected charges. The slow periods were different problems. Not enough clients to cover debts, anxiety about being dismissed for insufficient earnings, the madam's irritation making everyone tense. There was no winning, really, just different varieties of difficulty depending on whether business was good or bad. And the women learned to manage both situations, to push through exhaustion during busy times and anxiety during slow ones, to maintain equilibrium through whatever came, because breaking down wasn't an option when you had no safety net. The women experienced these busy periods as exhausting, multiple clients per night, sometimes seeing men back to back with minimal breaks, bodies becoming sore and minds becoming numb from the sheer repetitive nature of it, but also as opportunities to earn more, to potentially save a bit extra, though the madam would find ways to claim most of that extra income through special fees or unexpected charges. The slow periods with different problems, not enough clients to cover debts, anxiety about being dismissed for insufficient earnings, the madam's irritation making everyone tense. There was no winning, really, just different varieties of difficulty depending on whether business was good or bad. And the women learned to manage both situations, to push through exhaustion during busy times and anxiety during slow ones, to maintain equilibrium through whatever came, because breaking down wasn't an option when you had no safety net. And eventually, in the way things always eventually happen in places like this, even that equilibrium began to thin, not in a dramatic way, not with a single moment where someone stood up in the parlor and declared they were done with all of it, as though life had ever worked like that for working women in 19th century London. It thinned the way candlelight thins in a drafty room. You don't notice it at first. You just realize one night that the corners are darker than they used to be. It started with small things that weren't officially important. The madam's ledger grew heavier, not in size but in tone. The pencil marks seemed sharper. The calculations became less forgiving. A shilling here, a shilling there, added for laundry, for tea, for repairs, for a dress that had supposedly been damaged and therefore needed replacing, even if it was damaged by a client who'd grabbed too hard and paid nothing extra for the privilege. The madam would say it with a shrug, like weather, and the women would accept it the way you accept weather. Because you could complain, certainly. You could also complain about fog, and the fog would keep rolling in. Mary kept coughing. It was an ordinary cough at first, the kind everyone had in winter in London, because London was basically built out of damp brick, coal, smoke, and stubbornness, but hers stayed. It became a sound the house learned, like the creak of a stair, the clink of glasses, the distant rattle of carriage wheels outside. It came up in the mornings when she tried to sleep and couldn't, and it came up at night when she tried to laugh at the client's joke and found herself stopping to press a hand to her mouth. Some of the men didn't like it. They didn't say, "I'm worried you're ill." They weren't paying for concern. They said, with irritated delicacy, that it ruined the mood, as though the mood in question was ever particularly delicate to begin with. One man made a face like she'd spilled soup on his waistcoat. Another offered advice as though he'd been hired as a physician instead of a nuisance. The madam listened to these complaints with her professional expression, the one that suggested she cared very deeply about everyone's comfort so long as it improved revenue. She pulled Mary aside one evening and said, not unkindly, that perhaps Mary should take a day, just a day to rest, to recover, to get it out of her system, as if this was a system you could simply get things out of. Mary nodded. She said yes, because saying no would have sounded like defiance, and defiance was expensive. But her mind did the arithmetic instantly. A day off meant no clients. No clients meant no income. No income meant the room still cost 8 shillings, the meals still cost, the gin still cost, the candles still cost, the air itself seemed to cost if the madam could find a way to write it down. So Mary took her day off the way women in her position took days off. She stayed upstairs, coughing into her thin pillow, and when evening came, she came down anyway, because rest didn't pay rent. The new girl, the one everyone said was 16 and looked younger than that when the light hit her face wrong, began to change. That happened quickly. It always did. People talked about innocence as though it were a permanent feature, like eye color. In places like this, innocence was more like a delicate fabric, pretty, thin, useful for selling a certain idea, and not designed for heavy handling. At first, she sat stiffly in the parlor, hands folded like she was waiting for a train. Then she started laughing too loudly at men's comments, the way nervous people laugh when they're unsure what response is required. Then she started drinking, not much, just enough to stop her hands shaking. Then she started drinking more, because history, once again, choosing efficiency. One night, Mary found her in the upstairs corridor, leaning against the wall with her eyes unfocused, whispering to herself as though she were rehearsing a line. Mary didn't ask what she was saying. In a house like this, you learned not to ask questions that made answers real. Instead, Mary took her by the elbow and guided her into her own room, sat her on the edge of the bed, and gave her water. The girl drank like someone who hadn't realized water was allowed. She looked at Mary with something that might have been gratitude or might have been desperation attaching itself to the nearest stable object. Mary said, gently, that she should eat something. The girl said, in a small voice, that she didn't think she could. Mary didn't tell her it would get easier. That would have been a lie. She didn't tell her it would stay hard. That would have been useless. So she said the one thing that was actually practical. You've got to keep your strength, she said. And it sounded almost like advice. It sounded almost like there was a choice involved. Downstairs, the madam continued running the house with the calm focus of someone who had found a profession that suited her temperament. She hosted men with the same polite ease she might have used to host a church committee if churches had been more honest about what they were funding. She laughed at jokes she'd heard for 20 years. She poured drinks with practiced hands. She called the women girls, even when they were 30, because calling them women would have admitted too much. Sometimes men brought friends. Sometimes those friends were nervous. Sometimes they were bold. Sometimes they were cruel in the cheerful way that young men are cruel when they've been told the world belongs to them and they believe it. A group of clerks came in one Saturday night, smelling of cheap ale and fresh wages, and they shouted as though they were in a music hall. The madam smiled. Of course she did. She ushered them in. She encouraged them to spend. She made them feel like kings for an evening, because men loved nothing more than the illusion of power they didn't have to earn. One of them chose the new girl. The girl stood, smoothed her skirt, and went upstairs without looking at anyone. Mary watched her go and felt something tighten in her chest, and for a moment she couldn't tell if it was anger or sadness or just the familiar ache of being awake inside your own life. The older woman with the lesions got worse. The house pretended not to notice until it couldn't. Clients were not fond of visible illness. They preferred their suffering discreet, preferably hidden behind perfume and powder. When the sores appeared on her face, when she couldn't cover them properly, the madam began to complain about standards. The woman argued, quietly at first. She said she could still work. She said she could still earn. She said she just needed time. The madam listened with the same expression she used when someone asked for extra bread, sympathetic but unmoved. She said, with gentle finality, that it wasn't good for the house. And that was that. One morning the woman was gone. Not in an operatic way. No dramatic farewell. No embrace in the parlor. She simply disappeared, as people did in London all the time, swallowed by the city's machinery. Maybe she went to a hospital, maybe a workhouse, maybe a rented room where no one would hear her coughing. The madam rearranged the rooms that afternoon. Another woman took the space. The house continued. Mary understood then in a way she'd understood before, but never quite allowed herself to feel fully that the house did not contain a future. It contained nights. It contained transactions. It contained survival, but it did not contain a future. And the cruelest part was that the future outside the house didn't look much better, because the world beyond the red curtains was not a moral alternative. It was just a different kind of hunger. Mary began, slowly, to move her coins again. She had tried hiding money before. The madam had found it. The madam always found it. Whether through luck or through the simple logic of watching women who were desperate enough to hide money and then searching the obvious places. So Mary changed her method. She stopped keeping it all in one place. She kept a few coins in a seam of her dress, stitched into fabric that looked ordinary. She kept a few in the hollow behind a loose brick in the corridor, a brick no one noticed because no one cared about bricks in a brothel corridor. She kept a few with a woman in another house, a cautious kind of trust, the kind women built when no institution would protect them and they had to invent their own fragile systems. She didn't save fast. She couldn't, but she saved. And as she saved, she began to plan, not in the way sentimental literature liked to plan, with visions of sunlight and new beginnings, but in the way poor people planned, with logistics. Where could she go? Not back to her old employer, not to her family, if they'd even have her, and even if they wouldn't be able to feed an extra mouth. Not to a rescue home, because the thought of being renamed and lectured and put back to needlework felt like drowning in slow motion. So she thought about lodging houses. She thought about neighborhoods farther east where faces were less familiar and the police were different. She thought about taking laundry. She thought about selling vegetables. She thought about anything that involved money she could keep. One night she spoke to a client who was different. Not kinda, exactly. Just quieter, older. He wore a coat that fit properly, and he smelled of soap, the kind of smell that suggested he had a home where water was heated on purpose. He didn't drink much. He didn't boast. He asked her name, and she gave him the one she used in the house. He looked at her as though he understood it wasn't her real name and didn't mention it. When he was finished, he sat for a moment and said, mildly, that she looked tired. Mary nearly laughed. Tired was a word people used when they'd stayed up late reading. Mary was not tired in that sense. She was worn down, like stone steps. But she said nothing, because clients who tried to talk about your well-being were sometimes the ones who demanded the most, emotionally, and emotional labor was not priced separately. The man reached into his pocket and set down an extra coin, not ostentatiously, just quietly. For tea, he said, as though tea could fix her life. Mary stared at it. She said carefully, thank you. He left. She watched the door close and felt a strange sensation like stepping out of a hot room into cold air. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't hope, it was simply the reminder that men could choose to be decent in small ways, and most of them didn't, because decency was optional and optional things were often discarded. The madam noticed the extra coin eventually. Of course she did. She had eyes like a crow. She asked Mary about it in the kitchen the next day, her voice light. Someone's generous, she said. Mary said it was nothing. The madam smiled and said, well, if they can afford generosity, they can afford an extra shilling to the house. Mary felt heat rise in her face. She swallowed it, because anger didn't pay rent either. That winter dragged itself along. The fog came, went, came again. The cough in Mary's chest deepened. She began to wake at night with her mouth tasting of iron. She didn't tell anyone, not because she was proud, because saying it out loud would have made it true. And truth in that house was never useful. The new girl got her first fine. She'd been sent out, briefly, to fetch something. A ribbon, maybe, a bottle. Some small errand the madam didn't want to pay a servant to do. The girl returned pale, shaking, with a crumpled paper in her hand. Mary unfolded it and read the charge. Soliciting. Of course, the girl hadn't even been working. She'd been walking with a ribbon in her pocket. But the law didn't care about intent. The law cared about categories. And once you were in the category, you stayed there. The madam paid the fine with theatrical irritation and then wrote it down in the ledger in neat, unforgiving lines. The girl cried in the upstairs corridor, silent sobs, trying not to make noise. Mary sat beside her and said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't either a lie or an insult. Spring came late. When it did, it brought damp warmth, the kind that made the house smell of old fabric and stale gin. The women opened windows when they could. The madam complained about drafts. Clients complained about smells. Everyone complained, because complaining was free and it gave the illusion of control. Mary's cough did not improve. One afternoon, she tried to climb the stairs and had to stop halfway, gripping the banister, breathing hard. Her vision swam slightly. She stood there, listening to the house's sounds, footsteps, laughter, a piano note struck and released. A woman passed her on the stairs and paused. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. It was one of the women who kept a distance usually, the one who treated everyone like colleagues and nothing else, because closeness was dangerous. Mary nodded. The woman looked at her for a moment, then said, in the plain voice of someone offering a practical observation, "You can't work like this forever." Mary almost smiled. Forever? That was optimistic. She said, "I know." The woman hesitated, then said, "There's a place, a lodging house. They'll take you if you've got 2 weeks in advance." Mary's stomach tightened. 2 weeks in advance was a fortune, but it was also a number, a clear requirement, a thing that could be calculated. Mary asked, "Where?" The woman told her, and then she walked upstairs as though she hadn't just handed Mary a small piece of a possible exit. Mary began counting coins more obsessively. She stopped drinking as much, which made nights sharper and harder, but saved money. She took smaller doses of laudanum, which made her cough more noticeable, but saved money. She ate less, which made her weaker, but saved money. Every part of survival became a trade. The madam noticed Mary was earning less and began making comments, as madams did. Mary nodded, smiled, apologized. She kept saving. One night, a client became violent, not unusually violent, just violent in the ordinary way men could be when they believed payment made them owners. He grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise. He twisted her arm and laughed when she winced. He told her she'd better be more enthusiastic. Mary did what she always did. She performed. She learned long ago that the safest thing in the moment was often compliance. But when he was finished, when he stood and adjusted his coat with the calm satisfaction of a man who believed he had just enjoyed himself, he paused and said casually, "You're not very pretty, are you?" It wasn't the insult itself. She'd heard worse. It was the indifference, the way he said it, the way someone might remark on a chair being uncomfortable and then moved on. Mary felt something go quiet inside her. Not rage, not sorrow, just a kind of internal closing, like a door shutting. When he left, she stood at the basin and washed, and she stared at her own face in the cracked mirror. She saw a woman who looked older than she was. She saw a woman whose eyes had learned not to show anything. She saw, faintly, the shape of the girl she might have been if things had gone differently, and she thought, with dry clarity, that things had not gone differently, because in Victorian England, for women like her, different was mostly a decorative concept used in sermons. The next morning she went to the pawnbroker. She brought a small piece of jewelry a client had once given her, not out of affection but out of vanity, a gift that had sat in her drawer because she rarely wore it. She pawned it for less than it was worth, because everything in that world was worth less than it claimed to be. She left with coins in her palm and the uneasy feeling of having sold something that had never truly been hers. By the end of the week, she had enough for 1 week in advance at the lodging house. Not 2. 1. She worked another week. Her cough worsened. She began to spit blood into a rag and hide the rag. She finished the 2nd week. She counted her coins under the window at night, the alley below, quiet except for distant voices and the occasional scurry of something that lived in the refuse. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks. Not much, but it was the number. The next day she told the madam she was leaving. She did it carefully. She said she had a sick relative. She said she needed to go. She said she'd be grateful for everything the madam had done because politeness was armor. The madam listened, expression unreadable. Then she smiled, a small, cold smile. You've still got debts, she said. Mary's chest tightened. She had expected this. She had tried to plan for it. But the ledger was a weapon, and the madam wielded it gently, like a woman trimming flowers. Mary said, I've paid my room. The madam said, Your room, yes, and your food, and your dresses, and the doctor 2 months ago, and the fine for. Mary said, That wasn't mine. The madam's smile remained. It's written, she said, and of course it was. Ink was more powerful than truth. Mary stood there, breathing shallowly, trying not to cough. She said quietly, How much? The madam named a sum that was just large enough to break Mary's plan. Not impossibly large, not theatrical, just enough. Mary understood then what she had always understood. The house did not release women easily. It fed on their motion. It grew fat on their trapped arithmetic. Mary did not beg. She did not threaten. She simply nodded, as though accepting the weather again. That night she worked. She took clients. She smiled. She performed. When the house finally grew quiet in the early morning, when footsteps faded and doors closed and the madam went to her own room to sleep, the satisfied sleep of a woman whose business had run as intended, Mary got up. She dressed quietly. She took her coins from their hiding places. The seam, the brick, the little stash kept with the other woman, collected the pieces of herself she'd scattered like someone hiding from hunger. She packed nothing that looked valuable. She took only what could be carried without raising suspicion. A shawl, a spare shift, a comb, the rag she used for her cough, folded carefully. She moved through the corridor and paused outside the new girl's door. For a moment she considered waking her, but waking her would mean explanations. Explanations would mean promises. Promises were dangerous. So Mary simply stood there, listening to the sound of the girl sleeping, a soft breath in the dark. Then she turned and walked down the stairs, her hand on the banister, careful, slow, because her legs felt weak. At the front door she hesitated, not because she was sentimental, because leaving was an act that required believing, even briefly, that there might be something on the other side. She opened the door. The air outside was cold and damp. The street was quiet, fog moving in slow sheets. London smelled like coal and wet stone. Mary stepped out. She closed the door behind her with the smallest sound she could manage, not out of fear of being caught, though that too, but out of habit. The habit of trying to take up as little space as possible in a world that punished women for being visible. She walked, not fast. She couldn't. She walked through streets that were empty at this hour, past shuttered shops and dark windows. She passed a man sleeping in a doorway, his hat over his face. She passed a stray dog sniffing at refuse. She passed the Thames at a distance and caught its smell, that sour, heavy odor that made the city feel alive in the worst possible way. She reached the lodging house just as the sky began to lighten, not into bright morning, but into the pale gray of London dawn, the kind that looked like someone had tried to wash the darkness away and failed. The lodging house was an ordinary building. That was the point. It had no red curtains, no piano, no parlor with men pretending to be carefree, just a door, paint chipped, and a woman behind it who looked Mary up and down with the blunt appraisal of someone who could not afford to be naive. Mary said she had 2 weeks in advance. The woman held out her hand. Mary placed the coins in it. The woman counted them slowly, lips moving slightly, the way people did when they didn't fully trust numbers to behave themselves. Then she nodded. Room's up, she said. Mary climbed the stairs again. Always stairs. always narrow stairs. The room she was given was smaller than her brothel room, somehow, and barer. A bed, a chair, a window that looked onto a different alley that was no better, just unfamiliar. Mary sat on the bed and felt, for the first time in years, a strange quiet. Not peace, not happiness, just absence of immediate demand. No madam's voice downstairs, no clients, no ledger, just the sound of her own breathing, thin and uneven. She coughed into her rag. It came away stained. She stared at it. She did not cry. Crying was energy. She lay back on the bed, still dressed, and closed her eyes. She slept for hours, a heavy sleep that felt like falling. When she woke, it was afternoon. Light filtered through the window in a weak way. Her chest hurt. She tried to sit up and had to pause, breathing shallowly. She thought about food. She thought about money. She thought about what she could do now. Laundry, perhaps, or cleaning, or anything that involved hands rather than charm. She stood and moved to the window, looking down into the alley. Below, life continued. People walked. A cart rattled past. A woman called to a child. London did not care who left the brothel and who entered one. It simply absorbed. Mary lived like that for weeks. She found small work irregular, washing shirts for a woman who ran a small laundry operation out of her kitchen, scrubbing floors in a boarding house, carrying water, anything that paid a few pennies. The cough persisted. Sometimes it eased, sometimes it worsened. It became the metronome of her days. She ate when she could. She saved when she could, though saving now meant choosing between a hot meal and another day of rent. The lodging house was full of women like her, not necessarily from brothels, but from the same economic cliff edge, widows, abandoned wives, girls with no family, women who worked until they couldn't and then worked anyway. No one asked Mary what she had done before, not because they were kind, because they understood the rule. You didn't ask questions that might make you look at someone differently, because then you'd have to decide whether to judge them, and judgment was another luxury. One evening, weeks after she left, Mary walked past the street where she'd once worked. Not intentionally. She was returning from a job, hands raw from soap. She saw, through a gap in curtains, a familiar interior, a parlor with worn furniture, a piano, women sitting, waiting. She recognized one of them, the woman who had told her about the lodging house. Their eyes met briefly through the glass. The woman's expression did not change. It couldn't. You did not acknowledge in public, but her hand moved, just slightly, the smallest gesture, as if to say, "Yes, I see you." Mary kept walking. She did not turn back, because turning back was not a physical action. It was an entire surrender. Her body grew weaker through the summer. Consumption was patient. It did not rush. It did not need to. By autumn, she could not work as much. By winter, she struggled to climb stairs. The lodging house woman began to look at her with irritation, not cruelty, just the irritation of someone running her own narrow margins. Sick lodgers were bad business. Mary tried to pay anyway. She pawned what little she had. She sold her shawl. She skipped meals. Her face grew thinner. Her eyes grew larger. On a cold morning in January, she woke and realized she could not stop coughing. It came in waves, deep and tearing. Her chest burned. She coughed until she gagged. When it finally eased, she looked down and saw blood on the blanket, bright against the gray fabric. She sat very still. Then, slowly, she folded the blanket over the stain, not because she thought it would hide it, because it was a reflex, the reflex of women who spent their lives trying to make ugliness discreet so other people could pretend it wasn't there. She lay back down. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about the brothel, not with nostalgia, just with the detached logic of someone observing two bad choices. In the brothel, she had been exploited and fed. Outside it, she was exploited differently and starved more quietly. Victorian society had offered her morality like a gift, like a rope to climb, but the rope had been held just out of reach, and then everyone had looked surprised when she didn't climb. Her breathing slowed, not dramatically, just gradually. In the room next door, someone argued softly over a missing penny. Downstairs, someone laughed. The world continued in its small, indifferent motions. Mary's eyes half closed. She thought, hazily, of the new girl and wondered if she had survived her first year, if she had learned the same numbness, if she had begun hiding coins, if she had developed a cough of her own. She tried to imagine what it would have been like to be born into a different class, to have a room that was always warm, to have food without calculation, to have virtue without hunger pressing its thumb into your ribs. It was difficult to imagine because the imagination itself, like everything else, required resources. Her breath came shallow, then shallower, and then, as quietly as she had left the house with the red curtains, as quietly as she had moved through fogged streets before dawn, Mary slipped out of her own life with no great announcement, no moral lesson carved neatly into the moment, no Victorian author hovering nearby to give it narrative symmetry, just the simple fact that a young working class woman had been used by a city and then discarded when she could no longer be made profitable, and outside her window the gray London light kept spreading over wet cobblestones and chimney smoke and the indifferent machinery of daily survival. And somewhere not far away a parlor lamp was being lit again, and a piano was being touched by hands that didn't really want to play, and a ledger was being opened to a clean page, and another name was being written down in careful ink because the system did not mourn, it simply recorded, and the fog, faithful as ever, settled back into the streets like a curtain lowering slowly, gently, without applause, without meaning, just the inevitable hush of a city that had always been very good at swallowing women whole.